What we're going to talk about now is what do we have to do to apply to join ISICS. So if you want to use the system interoperably, there's a process that the user group committee and the board have put in place that is designed to be helpful for users and designed to help us make sure we appropriately manage the network. So Sean, if you could pull up, I believe it's slide 15. Thank you. So what we're going to talk about here is what are the user needs, the needs to determine the level of user, and there are 4, and then what an agency would need to do to complete a letter of intent so that we could begin evaluating their application process. So with that in mind, I wish I could give you an overview, but we're going to have to walk through this step by step. It's a multi-layered approach, and so we're going to start with that. So Sean, if you could, the next slide, please. If you notice going across the top, it says level of user in red, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the process to become a user, whether it's 1 being interoperability only, level 4 would be a user that's adding equipment, tower, additional coverage. There's something more that they feel they need to add to the system. And then we'll talk about 2 and 3 as we go down through the checklist. So first they would say, hey, we're interested in doing this, and you get a welcome letter back from ISICS, and you get a copy of the MOA that would need to be required because, of course, it's government entity to government entity, so the lawyers have to do the review of that. After you've reviewed those 2, then the entity would complete a letter of intent and submit it. So whether you're a level 1 to 4 user, everyone has to do the same thing. Sean, if you could give me the next slide. So now you get the letter of intent, and the letter of intent has said that, yes, we want to use it. Yes, it's been signed by a government entity, so a mayor, a member of the county supervisors, someone of authority has signed and said, yes, we're willing to do this. Because you're committing, if you will, to operate on the system in alignment with the guidance of the system, and it's not intended to be harmful. It's intended to make sure that we don't have any mischief happen that negatively impacts other users. So everyone has to complete an application, and we're going to ask, how many users are you asking to come on the system? Now, I have 400 users in my county, but we only plan to have 10 of them come on initially. Fine, that's what we'd like to know. Then we'd like to know the number of radios that you have in your community, city or county. And the reason we'd like to know that number of radios is that typically, when you look at what's happened in other states, if someone brings part of their operation onto a system, they ultimately want to see all of their operation on that system. It just takes a while, 4, 5, 6 years. Well, as I said, the sites are right now a minimum of 6 talk paths. If you said you got 1,000 radios, or there's you with 1,000 radios and somebody else with 1,000 radios, we need to get that back into the vendor and say, do we have enough grade of service for this, or do we need to beef this area up in knowing what the future may hold for us? So that's part of the reason why we ask. I've had a lot of questions about, why do you guys ask how many radios I got? That's why we ask. If you're using radios now, even if it's a dog catcher, even if it's a school bus, even if it's a whatever, they ultimately will probably find their way onto this network. Then we ask, well, what region are you in? And think about that. We'd want to know that. It helps us with the RIC assignment, so we can run it back through the RIC and say, is there any questions you folks might have for this particular unit? What county? Because it may not be the county itself, it could be a city. The city may ask to come on. And then the interop talk group agreements to have radios, be it county, region, or statewide. So there's an understanding that if you're coming on the system, this is an interoperability system. The primary purpose of it is being able to talk no matter where you go in the state of Iowa, that the interoperability talk groups would be included in your radios. And we will be working through a process to try and align that so that if someone picks up my radio, they should be able to find the interoperability talk group section of the radio. We'd like to see that by vendor in about the same place so that it isn't a mystery. One of the challenges that come up frequently at the SWIC conversations is, we had 5 people there. They all had the same frequency in the radio. It was all named differently, or it was in a place in the radio they couldn't find it. So it wasn't that they couldn't talk, they didn't know how to use their equipment. And so to the degree we can find a way to make that more elegant and more smooth, we can avoid that challenge. The realization is, I realize as your SWIC, not everybody's going out and talking on interoperability talk groups with any frequency. That's not happening all the time. We don't have a lot of training exercises for that yet. We have plans for that, but we don't have them now. So as we look at how we align this to make it elegant and easy for the user, that's the intent here. So that would be the interoperability talk group agreement, to have those talk groups in your radio, and then to have them positioned similarly. For those of you that are familiar with radios, does that mean that we prevent you from having the interoperability talk groups on any other place in the radio you want? Absolutely not. You can, as far as I'm concerned, you can put interoperability talk groups in every bank of the radio, if that's what you want to do and make it easier for your users. But we would like to see a particular bank in the radio that has just the interoperability talk groups, because then we also will get into the encryption side of things. And so it makes it a little easier to manage that. Any questions on that? Okay, next slide. So there's another section, and now you'll notice that to the right, could you go back one, Sean, please? Thank you. All of the questions thus far have been yes, 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 and yes for all 4 levels of users. Now the next slide, go ahead. We're going to get into things change a little bit. So if you want to be an interoperability user, what's a loading on the network? Pretty insignificant, because you're only using the interoperability talk groups. We got 6 talk paths per site. You're only using the interoperability talk groups. Doesn't matter where you go, you're only operating on 1 talk path. That's not hard to manage. Everybody's on that interoperability talk group. It's now when you get into operability and say, oh yes, we think we'd like interoperability, but oh, by the way, we also want to we think we want to run our police operations on this, or we want to run our fire operations on this, or we want to run our ambulances on this, or we want to run our school buses on this. Fine. If you think that makes sense for you, that's fine. We'd love to hear about it. But that changes your level of user from just interoperability to now you're moving into operability, which is at level 6. So you're an interoperability user. All you need is the radios that we talked about before. Life is good. Do you need a talk group? No, you don't need your own talk group now, because you're just using interoperability channels. If you need additional features or functions, now you not only need an operability talk group, you need some additional features. Perhaps you want to run, and I don't know what that feature or function might be off the top of my head, but I'm sure there's something. Let's say as one example that I've had some conversations with fire services, they think that they would like to perhaps use P25 paging because the system is so wide and it works. It would conceivably work on more than one network. Well, that would be an additional feature or function that we might find. Any questions about that? So we got operability users, interoperability users now. An operability user has to have a talk group. They need at least one, maybe more. And then additional features or functions. And this is in the application process. You explain to us what you're looking to do and why you're looking to do it. And then line 7 is we need not only the features and functions and not only the talk group, but we want more coverage. We want in-building coverage in our community, and we don't have that now. Okay, how do we go about doing that? There's a series of engineering values that have to be put together, and that fits into our greatest service for the network. And so you're looking at enhancements to the system. Even if small, you're looking at enhancements. And so there would need to be more questions about how do you see that, where do you need this coverage, and how do you see that occurring? So we've now moved operability, we've got to have a talk group, we've got some other features and functions, and now we're actually talking about expanding the coverage. Now maybe we're not building a new tower and putting infrastructure in, but we need additional coverage. Go ahead to the next slide, Sean. Whoops. Did we miss one? Oh, I missed a slide in the deck. So go back one, please. A level 4 user would now actually put up a tower. So they're constructing infrastructure. And why is that important? Because now we're getting into the backhaul of the microwave. So that level 4 user now, that particular user has more skin in the game. They brought infrastructure. They have microwave connection back to the zone controller. And they have the ability to, quite frankly, be independent of the system should they choose to in the future. So I've had conversations with a number of counties that have had some concerns about maintaining or keeping their independence if they were to come on with the statewide system. It's attractive to them for interoperability. And they thought, well, maybe I could do something with operability. Okay. Those are decisions that have to be made at the local level. But I encourage them, if you're going to put up a tower, why not look at getting 700 megahertz channels named for in your county's name from the local pool, add them to the system in the short term, and what happens is that now the grade of service has gone up demonstrably. Rather than 6 talk paths, you would have 2 more talk paths for every channel added. And I'm not really good at the math. That would be something that I'd leave to Roy and Jerry. But there's kind of this not infinity, but infinitesimal, is that the right word? It grows exponentially. The number of users you can have talking at one time as you add channels with 2 talk paths per channel as you add them to a site. So if a county says, hey, I don't trust the state, I'm concerned that they might, somewhere down life's road, I realize the legislature may change and they may have a different perspective. If I've got my own talk paths through 700 megahertz frequencies that are licensed in my county's name, and I have my own tower, I could be on my own system if I so chose. Still use the interoperability piece of it, but move my operations over and maintain local control or self-control. So that was, I apologize, that's a level 4 user. Tower, infrastructure, talk groups, all the stuff in the network and the ability to be independent should they choose to in the future. So, next slide, please. So what do we need to do if we say, okay, that all makes sense to me, I think I'd like to participate in this. So first we need is a letter of intent. And the letter of intent would then come to the board after you've done some self-examination of what you think as a community you'd like to do. And this letter represents an official request for access, and those words are taken right off the letter of intent that we have a boilerplate out on the website. All of this stuff is on the website. I haven't given you anything in this hour that isn't on the website. This letter of intent says, yep, we want to join, and here's the official request, and here's the person who's requesting it. So we request the interoperability move forward with an application packet. So once we get that letter of intent, this application packet of how many radios and what you want to do and where you think you're going will come back to you in an official letter from the chair of the ISICS board. That packet then has all of the things in it that I went over in the last few slides that will allow us to then walk through this. So let's go through those again. Next slide, please. So in completion of the letter of intent, we need to know what county you're from. Again, why is that important? It tells us what RIC you're in. It tells us what tower site you're likely to be on for engineering purposes and what your options may be if there's some other feature set that's already out there from another user. We need the city name if that's appropriate and the date the political authority passed a resolution that says, yes, we're going to do this. So to get the letter of intent, there's an official resolution passed by either the city or the county to say, yes, we're committed to participating in the interoperability, the operability, or growth of the system. So we ask sort of clarification, and this is all over the board depending upon the application. Some of them have just been from sheriff's offices. Some of them have been from sheriff and police. Some of them have been from sheriff, police, and fire. We've had now some from fire only. We haven't had any from EMS only yet. But we began to see that there's a pretty good chance that 911 dispatch will have an interest in this as we move down life's roads. And of course, then there's corrections and hazmat and other specialties. So there are some disciplines, particularly in the fire service, that have teams that deploy to different parts of the state. We're interested, if they want to come on board, we need to understand how many users you're going to take and where exactly are you going to see them going most frequently, because it potentially could affect the greatest service. That's the reason for asking these questions. Now, I haven't said this, but one of the things we're working on now is, once you've submitted your letter of intent and you have completed the application and the committee has reviewed it, we've got a team put together to reach back out to the local unit of government and say, help us understand these areas. The way you filled it out made sense, but we want to make sure we can truly understand what it is you're asking for. So there's a bit of a vetting process that we're going through to help make sure that we understand what the implications are to the system and what those people expect to get from it. Next slide, please. So there are some communities that see interoperability at its broadest context. Some see interoperability at a fairly narrow context. Police, fire, EMS, sheriff's office. That's interoperability. Others see it all the way down to, today, transportation vehicles, school buses, garbage trucks, you name it. Anybody that's in the government space, they believe should be included in part of the interoperability continuum and interoperability discussion. If they outsource their towing, if they have contractual services for that, the board has passed a resolution that you can be on the system, but they're going to be on the system under the auspices of the city, not under the auspices of the towing service. The same thing can be said for private security. There are elements in times in some of these communities when it makes sense for them to bring in a private security firm to help at a particular event. That's fine. Can they be on the interoperability system? Yes, they can. How do we do that? You let us know, and our relationship of the board is with the city or the county, not with a private entity. We don't have a methodology for having a relationship with a private entity. We do have a methodology for having a relationship with the community. So it's through the application process. So can I have a private security firm on my interoperability channels under the auspices of a local police department? Absolutely. If that's what you need to do, we're willing to work with you on it. That's what we're looking to see happen. So that's the other disciplines aspect we talk about. The other thing we want to know about is, what are you currently using? Are you on VHF, UHF, 7-800? Why? Well, if you're on VHF, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to want to carry a part of that with you, and that gets into perhaps dual band radios, or is there a chance that you're going to want to patch that? This system will allow you to tie together two systems for a period of time. Is there a chance you're going to want to do that? If the answer to that is yes, there are system implications to that we need to understand. Okay? Next is the number of users of ISICS. So in this topic, how many of your users do you see coming on soon? So you say, well, we want police, we want fire, and we want EMS coming on right now. We're ready to do the interoperability. We don't need to do anything else, just that. That's easy, not a lot of loading. We want to bring that same group on, but we want 5 talk groups for each of my disciplines. 5 talk groups for police, 5 talk groups for fire, 5 talk groups for EMS. Wow, now that changed the dynamic pretty significantly. Now we're getting into system loading. How many users, how many talk groups begins to get into that greatest service component. And so the guarantee from the vendor is that we will keep greatest service at, out of 100 calls, only 1 will fail. And as I told you earlier, failing means it's delayed, not necessarily a complete bop out of the system. It just can be a delay. That counts as a failure. So the number of users and where those users show up becomes really important. That's part of, I hope all of this is making sense, is kind of going through a funneling process. Number 7, next slide. So that pretty much takes us to the end of what it takes to come on the